Have you ever apologized for being hurt? Not because you believed it, but because it was easier than defending your truth one more time. You weren't wrong, you weren't dramatic. You just learned that speaking up made things worse. So you stayed quiet, and over time you stopped trusting the very feeling that told you something was off. It didn't happen all at once. Gaslighting is not a lightning strike. It's fog. You don't notice it moving in. You only realize you're lost when the landscape starts to shift and the landmarks no longer make sense. They say something that stings, you flinch. You speak, they laugh or deny. Or worse, they look at you with calm pity and say, that's not what happened. And you pause because they sound so certain, because they're not yelling, because they seem reasonable. But the more you rewind it, the blurrier it becomes. So you doubt, you soften. You edit your memory like a fragile photograph, trimming edges, adjusting light, erasing contrast, until you barely recognize what's real anymore. That's how it begins. And this is the trap. It feels like maybe you're just being careful. Like maybe you're growing, maturing, learning to regulate your emotions. But what you're really doing is shrinking your voice to make space for someone else's comfort. Carl Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But what he didn't say is what happens when they make you carry the consequences of that avoidance, when they reshape the world so they never have to look inward and then call you unstable for reacting to it. Gaslighting doesn't always look like abuse. Sometimes it looks like logic, like charm, like concern. It can wear a smile and still suffocate your truth. It can come from someone who says they love you and still demand that you stop seeing what you see. This is what the intermittent reinforcement cycle does. It rewards your silence with peace. It punishes your clarity with withdrawal. So you adapt, you bend your reality to keep the connection alive. And somewhere in that bending, you start to break. But here's the paradox. You didn't go crazy. You just got good at surviving a lie. You didn't forget how to feel. You were taught that feeling made you weak. You didn't lose your mind. You were rearranged in the image of someone else's denial. And the worst part? No one else noticed. Not even you, until it was almost too late. There's a violence that leaves no bruises. You can't photograph it. You can't hold it up in court. But it lives in your muscles, your voice, your instinct to flinch when nothing is visibly wrong. It's the subtle panic before you speak, the second guessing, the carefulness, the need to explain yourself before you've said anything at all. That isn't overthinking, that's trauma grooming. And it starts with a lie you don't notice until you've already swallowed it. Gaslighting is not just manipulation, it's psychological reprogramming. It teaches you not just to doubt others, but to doubt yourself before anyone else has to. This is the fawn response in disguise. It's not passivity, it's protection. It's a nervous system trained to perform peace at all costs, even if it means sacrificing your truth. And the worst part is you thought this meant you were strong. You thought your empathy, your flexibility, your ability to rise above it made you mature. But it was never maturity, it was emotional captivity wrapped in virtue. Simone Weil said, the danger is not that the soul should doubt whether there is any bread, but that by a lie it should persuade itself that it is not hungry. That's what gaslighting does. It convinces you to deny your hunger for clarity. It persuades you that your need for truth is evidence of a defect, that your anger is immaturity, that your sadness is sabotage, that your memory is unreliable unless it benefits them. And so you shrink, you fold your experience into something digestible. You tell yourself it's not worth bringing up, that maybe it was your tone, that maybe it's just you, and then one day you're not sure what your tone is anymore, or your truth, or your reality. I once heard a story about a woman who began secretly recording her conversations, Not to prove a point to anyone else, but to prove to herself that she wasn't losing her grip. She would cry after arguments, listen to the tape, and realize she hadn't raised her voice once. That's what it means to live in gaslight. You start documenting your life like a crime scene. Because someone has made your truth illegal. But here's the reality no one could fully erase. What you feel is valid. Even if they mocked it, even if they rewrote it, even if no one else saw it happen. Gaslighting thrives on silence, on your willingness to carry both your pain and their permission to ignore it. On your ability to suffer beautifully without making a mess. But truth doesn't require permission, and you don't need proof to stop bleeding. Speak, even if it shakes, even if no one claps, even if your voice trembles and your certainty isn't perfect. Because the moment you say it, even once, the architecture of their illusion begins to crack. And the only thing stronger than their story is your voice returning. They don't start with blame, they start with doubt. You question the moment, then the memory, then yourself. Not because you're unstable, but because they're unstable in such a convincing way, it begins to feel like sanity. Gaslighting doesn't look like evil, it looks like contradiction. One moment warm, the next indifferent, supportive in public, dismissive in private. You try to hold it all together, but the more they shift, the more you unravel. Because they don't wear one face, they wear five. And each one is designed to fracture your trust in the only compass that matters, your own perception. The first is the caretaker, the benevolent tyrant. They say it's love, they say they just want what's best for you. You try to express a need and they sigh gently like a parent correcting a child. I just think you're being a little reactive. You're so sensitive lately, are you okay? You walk away wondering whether you're overthinking things, whether your tone really was too sharp, whether you should be grateful someone's trying to love you at all. Then comes the rationalist, the logical assassin. They never get angry, they don't argue, they explain. Let's be objective. I think you're misremembering how that happened. They flatten your emotions under the weight of their intellect. You find yourself rehearsing every word before speaking because now you have to prove your feelings, like evidence in a court you didn't know you were standing in. The third is the withholder, the disappearing mirror. They don't insult you, they just remove themselves, mid-conversation, mid-intimacy, mid-apology. The distance says you're too much. You reach out once, then again, then again. They reply with silence or clipped tones. And when you finally ask what's wrong, they say nothing. Why are you being so paranoid? Now you're not just hurt, you're crazy for noticing it. Next is the saint, the public hero, private phantom. They charm every room but yours. They give their best words, their warmth, their attention to everyone else. And in private, you're left with cold indifference or subtle scorn. You try to explain this to a friend, but they look at you sideways. But they're such a good person. And that's when the loneliness sets in. When no one believes you, and you start wondering if you believe yourself. And then the most subtle mask, the echo eraser. They praise your empathy, your strength, your loyalty. But only so you'll turn those traits inward, against yourself. You forgive what shouldn't be forgiven. You rationalize their coldness because they're going through something. And over time, you become their caretaker, their alibi, their mirror, until your boundaries collapse into their wounds. Each mask is designed to confuse and invert. You say, I'm in pain, and they reply, you're ungrateful. You say, I feel erased, and they say, you're imagining things. You say, I need clarity, and they call you controlling. But here's what they never admit. If they can distort your reflection, they never have to face their own. You were never the unstable one. You were the one who refused to pretend. And the reason they worked so hard to destabilize you was because your clarity was exposing something they couldn't bear to see. When you finally stop trying to decode their contradictions, something remarkable happens. You stop asking why they keep changing, and you start asking why you keep explaining. Because you're not the mask, you never were. You're the one who saw behind it. You thought you were healing. You were actually disappearing. Not all wounds scream. Some dim you slowly. And that's what makes them so dangerous. By the time you realize you're fading, you've already become a stranger to yourself. You didn't call it abuse. You called it working on things. You didn't call it fear. You called it trying to keep the peace. You didn't call it self-erasure. You called it growth. This is the brilliance of gaslighting. It doesn't just silence your voice, it teaches you how to silence it yourself. You began saying it for them, I'm just tired. It's probably my fault. They didn't mean it that way. It wasn't peace you were protecting, it was a performance. And the longer you kept the act going, the more your nervous system began to confuse silence with safety. This is the fawn response in its most invisible form. You regulate your truth to soothe someone else's discomfort. You perform neutrality to avoid punishment. And the better you get at minimizing yourself, the more they reward you with their presence, until presence becomes a prize you have to earn by being less of who you are. And still, you told yourself this was strength. That self-denial was emotional maturity. That understanding their pain mattered more than protecting your own. Carl Jung once wrote, "You meet your destiny on the road you take to avoid it." And this is what it looks like. You avoid conflict to preserve connection and end up walking away from yourself entirely. There's a woman I remember reading about who started deleting old voicemails, ones where she cried, where she begged, where she apologized over and over for something she hadn't done. She said she couldn't bear to hear that version of herself anymore, not because it was weak, but because it was honest. And it reminded her of how thoroughly she had been trained to betray her instincts in the name of keeping it together. That's the real damage of gaslighting. It's not just what they convince you to question, it's what they convince you to abandon. You abandon your memory, you abandon your anger. You abandon your right to say that happened, and it hurt. And slowly your life begins to feel distant. You watch it like a movie where you can't remember if you were the one living it or just the one apologizing in the background. But numbness is not who you are. It's who you became to survive an environment that made clarity dangerous. And if you're still there, still doubting, still shrinking, still trying to be reasonable while your body screams otherwise, then let me tell you this. You are not confused. You are not broken. You are not too sensitive, too much to anything. You're waking up, and awakening isn't gentle. It rips the blindfold off in the middle of the night. It makes you grieve the version of you that made herself small just to be loved. But that grief is not weakness. It's the return of your emotional oxygen. The truth is, you've always known. You just didn't have permission to believe yourself until now. Because now, you no longer need their approval to trust what your soul already whispered. You're not imagining it. You're not being dramatic. You're not hard to love. You're remembering. And the first step to healing is refusing to forget again. Reclaiming your reality doesn't begin with rage. It begins with something quieter, something almost invisible at first. A whisper beneath the noise, a strange stillness that says, this isn't right. You've spent so long narrating someone else's version of your life that hearing your own voice again might feel like rebellion. But it's not rebellion, it's repair. The first way back is this. Believe yourself, without proof, without consensus. Without needing a panel of external judges to say, yes, you're allowed to feel that. Because you are. If it hurt, it matters. If you felt lost, it was real. If you question everything, that's not weakness, that's evidence. The second is to stop apologizing for your clarity. You don't have to explain why your memory remembers what theirs denies. You don't have to soften your truth so someone else can sleep at night. Peace built on distortion is not peace. It's performance. And every time you apologize for knowing what you know, you teach your nervous system that self-betrayal is safer than self-trust. The third is to reconnect with your body, the only compass that never lied to you. Even when your mind was spinning in doubt, your body was already speaking. The stomach drop, the racing pulse, the tension in your jaw, these weren't overreactions. They were warnings, ancient, precise, sacred. You don't need someone else's validation to make sense of what your body already knows. The fourth is to stop calling emotional starvation strength. To stop clapping for yourself every time you swallow your needs just to keep a relationship alive. You weren't being strong, you were being conditioned. And now strength looks like asking. Strength looks like leaving. Strength looks like trusting that love without clarity isn't love, it's camouflage. And finally, the fifth way back is to speak. Not to convince them, not to restore the past, but to name the truth aloud so the spell breaks. Because silence is the soil where gaslighting grows. But your voice is wildfire. Your voice is flood. Your voice is the thing they feared most, not because it's loud, but because it makes their fiction unlivable. Carl Jung wrote that we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. And now, maybe for the first time, you're beginning to meet yourself without one. No disguise, no performance, just you. The version that never needed to be corrected. The version that never needed to be explained. You are not rebuilding who you were. You are returning to who you were before you were taught to question your reality. And with each step, each whisper, each no, each truth, you don't just reclaim your mind. You reclaim the right to live inside a life that doesn't distort you. They called you dramatic when you were grieving, unreasonable when you were finally drawing the line, crazy when you were beginning to remember. But here's the truth they couldn't afford you to know. You weren't losing your mind. You were waking up in someone else's illusion, and of course it felt like madness. Of course it felt disorienting, because when you've spent months or years inside a carefully constructed fiction, the truth doesn't arrive like a sunrise. It arrives like an earthquake. Clarity doesn't feel peaceful at first. It feels violent, lonely. It rips the comfort from denial and forces you to face a mirror no one else will look into. You didn't unravel because you were unstable. You unraveled because you stopped lying to yourself. And the moment you stopped explaining, softening, apologizing, that was the moment you stopped performing someone else's version of love and began remembering what love feels like when it doesn't cost your sanity. You were never broken. You were rearranged. You were never weak. You were surviving inside a story that required you to doubt your reflection. And now you see it, don't you? That they needed you to be confused so they could stay comfortable. That they needed you to be quiet so their mask wouldn't slip. That your awakening wasn't their betrayal. It was their exposure. Carl Jung, who spent his life exploring the war between the false self and the soul, said, "You are not what has happened to you. You are what you choose to become." And now finally you choose clarity, not because it feels good yet, but because it is real. There's no script for returning to yourself, no map, no applause. But the moment you stop seeking their approval and start honoring your own perception, the spell breaks. The fog clears, the self they buried begins to rise. And when she rises, she doesn't return to who she was. She becomes who she was before they told her that truth was a threat, before they convinced her that silence was maturity, before they taught her to fear her own voice. And when that voice finally speaks again, it does not tremble. It names the story, it names the damage, and it names itself sacred. Rumi once wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you. So if your clarity came through collapse, if your awakening came dressed as madness, if your healing came only after forgetting who you were, let that be your proof you were never crazy. You were becoming free. And if this video reminded you of who you were before the doubt, before the silence, before the forgetting, write it down, speak it out, or simply comment, "I remember." Because someone else is still inside the fog, and your voice might be the first one that helps them see through it. You don't owe anyone your silence, not anymore. You owe yourself your return, and now you're home.